Building 4.0 connects leading organisations to share ideas and research that will lead to better, safer and faster building methods for the future. In this conversation, CEO of Lendlease Digital, Bill Rue, interviews his former boss, business legend Jeff Immelt. As CEO of General Electric, Jeff spent 16 years steering one of the world's largest organisations through a period of unprecedented growth and change. Jeff's new book, Hot Seat, is packed with amazing stories from this era. And in this conversation with Bill, he takes us even further behind the scenes to share insights about leadership, R&D, and the challenges today of balancing physical and digital innovation.
Well, hi, Jeff. It's certainly great to have you as part of this fireside chat.
Hey, Bill, it's so great to see you again. I loved working with you, so it's great to be even virtually sharing the stage with you.
I think, jumping right into this and focusing on the innovation part of it, when you look at your book, Hot Seat, what struck me in reading the book is just how much emphasis you put into innovation and research when you took over as the CEO of GE. Why don't you talk about why that emphasis and some of the successes that came out of that effort?
Bill, I spent my career kind of growing up inside the company, and I was always what I would call a product person. I always liked technology and innovation, and even though kind of the era that I kind of rose my career in GE was more of a process innovation, things like Six Sigma and Lean. I always felt like products were the key. Technology was the key. I think every business leader and every company understands the science of winning in their industry. And in the businesses we were in, whether it was aviation or energy or healthcare, I could go down the list. Having the best products always was immensely powerful. Products and services and things that solve problems, for customers and things like that. So that was always what was in the back of my mind. I was always willing to invest in it. I was always willing to take risks on new products and new technologies. And I just found that was the key to market share, customer satisfaction, and everything else. Bill, when I became CEO of GE, 80% of the profits of our power business was selling one product in one market, big gas turbines in the US. And you look at that and say, that's just unstable. That's not sustainable. That's not, it's not positive. It's not powerful. And by, the time that the decade went by 2010, that one product in one market was 10% of our earnings. And the other 90% was almost a dozen products, each one of which had at least $500 million of revenue. So being able to fund innovation, being able to fund technology, and having lots of products, I just think is the key to success. And I think many times, particularly in legacy businesses, people don't spend enough time on that. I won't be too long-winded, just one last vignette. If you think about Tesla and Elon Musk, look, it's an electric vehicle, right? That's key. But I think what he knew was that an electric vehicle didn't have to be a crappy car, right? When he came out with the Tesla, all the other electric vehicles were horrible, right? And so you think about, the success of Tesla, really more than being kind of a climate changing innovation, it was just a great car, right? And I think that's where legacy industry people fall down. They don't spend enough on innovation. They don't value technology.
I think one of the things, and reminding you that a lot of the folks attending this are coming from our research efforts, the Building 4.0 research effort here in Australia, and it is really unique in that it's driven by researchers primarily out of universities, and businesses participating together. And there's a lot of tension between the two, right? Because one thinks very differently than the other. And you live this. I mean, you invested in the Global Research Center, and you were able to get a lot of leverage out of the Research Center. But how did you deal with that tension? And how do you think about that between the research community and the businesses? And what do you got to do to make those things work together?
You know, there's a healthy tension, Bill, and time horizon that always matters. And I think that's a good thing, right? I think it's good that some people are looking over the horizon, and it's good that some people are worried about making quarterly earnings, and it takes everybody to make a difference. I think what I tried to do was two things. One was look for, technologies that could span the entire company. We did, it took a decade to develop what was called a ceramic matrix composite. This had the strength of titanium, but was a fraction of the weight. And it could go into jet engines, and it can improve fuel performance and weight by 1 or 2%. And that's worth billions to airlines. Now, that took 15 years to bring to market. We had to invent the product. We had to invent the process, and everywhere in between. But that's what it took to win, right? That's what it took to be successful. So on one hand, you have to take a look at technologies that benefit the entire company and make sure those are funded. The second thing is, go ahead, Bill. I'm sorry.
No. Go to the second thing.
Yeah, I was going to say, for the people in the audience that represent industry, you have to understand that your responsibility is funding the future. Like, I think business schools have produced too many professional managers who think that like magic dust and just a little bit of financial engineering gets you to the finish line. And it really doesn't, right? So I think it's really important that people take a few bets that are out over the horizon and make sure that those are being invested in and coming to the fore. And I don't see enough of that. I don't see enough coming from business schools. And I just think that's something that the next generation is going to value. So
I'm taken with your comment about Elon Musk. And in reading about his story and Tesla, it's amazing. It did take like 10 years for that to become successful. And there was no guarantee in there if you just read about some of the challenges. So is there something magic about you got to be in it for that 10 to 15 years?
Yeah, I think hard things take time. I'm sorry, Bill, but Bezos one time said to me that valuable things are hard. Right. And this was probably in the early 2000s. And his CFO was a guy named Tom Skutak, who was my CFO at GE when I was in GE Plastics. And so we got to know each other reasonably well because Tommy was a friend of mine. Right. And so Jeff and I were having dinner in Seattle. And I was talking about like all the money he was losing and negative cash flow and all this other stuff. And he just said, Jeff, look, valuable things are hard. If everything could be your jet engine business, we would have a really valuable world. And that's exactly the way you have to look at it, Bill, is that it takes time to really kind of build things of value. And that's what people have to be in it for.
Well, and then, Elon Musk startup, Bezos startup, can the let's take the car companies, or take any industry you want. Can big companies really win, or is this innovation? Is it really a small company game to go in? And what are your thoughts on all that?
It's a great question. You and I lived it to a certain extent together, and have the scars to show for it. I would say there's really a value in scale, and there's a value in innovation and scale. I was running our healthcare business in the late 90s, and we decided to launch an ultrasound business. We were big in MRs and CTs, but it was clear that ultrasound was going to be a growth modality. So we actually recruited Omar Ishrak, who who ended up running Medtronics, but he spent 15 years plus in GE. And we basically built an ultrasound business from scratch inside a big company that over, let's say, a decade or 15 years became number one, became a $4 billion high margin business because we could leverage all of our capability and all of our technology. We gave it room to grow. So I think, when you can make scale work for you, I think it really matters, and you can get it done in big companies. I think the challenge, Bill, is, knowing, and you and I live this, knowing what to do is not always that hard, and knowing how to do it is not that hard, but knowing when to do it, having a sense of timing. And I would say if you look at GM, if Mary Barra had gone all in an electric vehicle in 2010, she would have gotten fired, right? She had no capability to do what Elon Musk did. Her investors wouldn't let her, her company wouldn't let her, her board wouldn't let her, but she waited 10 years. She did some partnerships. And now GM is, launching vehicles in the next 5 or 10 years, and they'll have a good position. So I think sometimes, knowing when to do things, or how, if you're a legacy company, knowing how to stay on the dance floor through partnerships or other things, so that you're there for the long term is really an art form. And something, when I see legacy companies here in the Valley, something I try to coach them on.
Yeah, in many ways, the legacy startups of yesterday, they have the same problems of any big company, because once you become a big company, that bureaucracy kicks in. It's hard to stay that innovator through it. You've looked at Amazon; they seem to stay an innovator, through it. Do you think there's something special they do, or somebody else?
There's something culturally at Amazon that's worked, where they're able to break things down into small components, and they're able to give people enough leeway so that even though they're a huge company, they're able to give people enough leeway to kind of do experimentation and kind of run. And I think to your point, Bill, they may be the best example of kind of a scale-based company that can still innovate, right? And that's really important. But it's, the fact is that, if you're Boeing, you should be launching rockets right now, just like SpaceX. And I think sometimes we give up our turf for no reason, right? There's no reason why Blue Origin and SpaceX have to be the only kind of modern rocket companies. Northrop Grumman and Lockheed and Boeing ought to be in that play. So I think some of it's just intellectual laziness, and some of it is the fact that it is hard to get things done sometimes in big companies.
Yeah, and in your book, you talk about 3 kinds of innovation: vertical, horizontal, exponential innovation. I was really taken by this because we did live through all that. But why do you break it up like that, or how do you think about it in those categories?
I think it's it's kind of the way the world works, and particularly when you're in a conglomerate, these are the things you've got to be thinking of. When I say vertical innovation, it's making a more fuel efficient, let's say, jet engine than Rolls-Royce or Pratt Whitney, right? That's vertical. That's in an industry. That's innovative, gains you market share. Things like that. When I talk about horizontal innovation, it's a company like GE realizing that they have more additive parts made through additive manufacturing that anybody else in the world has. So why not get in the business, right? Why not get into a business that can make you more productive, that can drive incremental growth, and can lead you in the future? That's horizontal innovation. And I'd say both of those are technically driven. I think exponential innovation is one that kind of marries technology with business model change. And that's what's really the hardest to do in a legacy company. Probably the best example I can come up with is, an old GE colleague is a guy named Joe Hogan. Joe runs a company called Align Tech. It takes additive manufacturing, new materials, and makes aligners, right, for instead of braces. And that company has their market cap has grown tenfold in the last 5 or 6 years because it's exponential growth. It's exponential value. It's taking a manufacturing technology and a consumer need and helping them meet. And I think it's always good to keep your eyes open. I'm in a VC world now. I think about this a little bit, but even legacy companies have to kind of keep their eyes open for what are the things that are going to be exponential growth. I taught in my business school class in the 2000s. We owned NBC. We were actually launched Hulu when Netflix was just a VCR company, right? And inside NBC, we were worried that the cable companies would get pissed off at us because streaming would hurt their business. And so we slowed down, right? And now, Netflix is worth more than every media company combined because it was an exponential play. And we were too close to it to see the way it was really going to evolve as time goes on. So I think you need to keep your eyes open for what are the two exponential ideas that could happen in your space.
Picking up on what you're doing now, venture partner at NEA, teaching at Stanford, has that really changed the way you think about innovation? And what are you learning as you go through?
It's a long question. Bill, you and I could spend an entire dinner talking about this one just because I've learned so much. I would say, and you came from the Valley, I would say today in venture, there's an infinite amount of money. It used to be venture capital could fund small ideas with small bets. But now, there's nothing that can't be funded with venture capital. Like there's so much money that you can build new material science companies, new hardware companies, new software companies. So the flood of talent and money and ideas is really incredible in venture today. And I'd say that's changed even since I've been here. Bill, is just the ability to do things has never been greater. And then I just think there's something unique about the Valley and its willingness to accept failure, to accept experimentation, that really makes it such that everybody should come and take a look at it. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of flaws. I think the whole kind of look, it's hard to build things that last, that people leave their jobs every 12 months. And, if you got to pay somebody 3 times more a year from now than what you paid them now, it's hard to build culture and all that stuff. So there's, we have our challenges for sure, but there's a lot of exciting stuff that goes on. And then I think students, I probably taught now 400 or 500 students over the last, let's say 4 or 5 years. I think they're children of crisis, Bill. They've lived through, a 30-year-old has lived through COVID. They've lived through the financial crisis. And probably half my students want to start their own company, not necessarily because they want to become billionaires or wealthy or all that stuff, mainly because they want control of their life, right? They don't trust us. They don't trust people like me to plan their destiny. They kind of say, at least I can depend on myself. I can build my own company on my own time, and that's worth it. And so I really do think the next generation is very different from both a business and social standpoint, mainly because they've seen, really nothing but crisis over the last 10 or 15 years, and that shapes people.
It sort of takes us into a little more of a leadership discussion, which is the other part of the book that's fascinating. And, in many ways, you face more challenges than any other CEO I've ever seen. Starting on the second day of 9/11 and then going through a lot of changes. And you've messaged this and talked about the fact that the world's much more complex than it was in the 80s and 90s. And I think that goes back to what you just talked about as to how students see it. They live through all this complexity. And so, how did you deal with it? Because I believe leaders of the future are going to be faced with much more complicated challenges than the leaders of the 80s and 90s. And how did you deal with some of those great challenges? What are some of the personal attributes
I think, Bill, you've got to be able to absorb fear, right? So I think some people are kind of like fear accelerators. Some people are fear absorbers. I think if you're going to lead in this era, you've got to be somebody that's willing to kind of not panic, take it on yourself to solve the problem, not make things worse. It's just you've got to absorb fear. You've got to make decisions. Bill, it's just like you don't have a time or you don't have enough information or things like that. You've got to be willing to make decisions. You've got to hold two truths really at the same time, that things can always get worse, but there is going to be a future. Something that maybe some of the people in the audience would appreciate is in like 2002 or 2003, Boeing announced a new aircraft called the 767, the Dreamliner. And in theory, it was going to be able to fly from Sydney to New York City nonstop, right? And it was the absolute worst time to announce a plane like that. It was right after 9/11 and SARS, and it was really a crappy time. But it was a symbol that the industry was going to have a future and that people could participate. And that's, I think, another part of leadership. If I would look at COVID, what I would say is people only held one truth in COVID, Bill, and that's that things could get worse. And that's why we see supply chain issues and things like that. So there's a couple things that, whether you're talking about the financial crisis or 9/11, that are key traits that leaders have over that time period. And then I'd say personally, you just have to be able to differentiate yourself between critical thinking and critics, right? You need critical thinkers around you who are people that are going to say, hey, look, Jeff, here's the way you have to think about things, and think about it this way, and here's what we can do about it, and here's how to make it better. And I think in a crisis, you have to be willing to accept critical thinkers, but you've got to block out critics. People are saying you're doing a crappy job, you should be fired, and you just can't listen to critics. You need to listen to critical thinkers. You can't listen to critics because most times they don't care, right? They're lazy. They want to cover their ass. And you have them both inside your company and outside your company, and you have to be able to differentiate between the two.
You were ahead of your time in pushing eco-imagination. Look, today everybody talks about sustainability, zero carbon emissions, and you were having that discussion over 20 years ago. Probably took a lot of I had a lot of critics at that time because everyone, how do you make money? How do you, take us through what got you into thinking about that? And what do you think about the future of sustainability? What do leaders have to think about? What's important? Can you make money at it? All those things.
It's a great question, Bill. I would say, 20 years ago, what you could see in the environment was, I would say, changing attitudes, changing legislation. We could see it, from refrigerators to turbines to aviation, that this was going to be something that had a long-term perspective. And we looked at the science. I had people at the research center kind of study climate change, read the reports from Stanford and the UN and Columbia, and we came to our own conclusions about warming and things like that. So, we were well grounded, I would say, in terms of where we started at that time. And this was maybe 2005. I think, Bill, where we are today is really interesting and challenging. I think there's now a global consensus that climate change is real, caused by man. We need to do something about it. We need to do something quickly. But people talk about energy transition. There actually needs to be a transition. So if you look at like how power is generated, if you look at kind of the way most industries run, things like that, there's going to have to be transitional technologies like sequestration, building efficiency in your world. And I think governments in particular, are super naive about going from where we are today to 2050 but not understanding what we have to do in 2025 and 2030 and 2035. And that's going to create chaos. And so when I look at like COP26, as much as there's consensus, there's little planning that goes with it. And I think that's going to create lots of bottlenecks and things like that. Australia, I love Australia. I love the people. I love the country. I love going there. But it's got the worst energy policy of any country, mainly like any developed country in the world. And, I used to show the board a fact that said, if you took half the coal plants, took them offline and replaced it with natural gas, just that step, you'd reduce CO2 by 17% around the world. It's the single biggest thing you could do. Yet that would be booed off stage, right, in any environment. So I think what I would urge all the people in the audience or business leaders is to think about the 2 or 3 practical steps you can take today to get on the path, to avoid the fads and things like that. And really, the world will be helped by making more changes quickly than thinking that every citizen in the U.S. is going to be driving an electric vehicle by 2030, because that ain't going to happen, right? That is not going to happen. And that's, so in many ways, we've made a ton of progress. And in many ways, I still think we're very naive about what it's going to take to actually solve this existential problem.
So, if you build on that, you've seen and you've been a part of leading changes in aviation, transportation, energy, healthcare. Look into the future. What are some of those changes that you're seeing now? What are those things you look at and go, there's some great opportunity in those areas? That's where real change is coming in the future. These are the industries, I think, that are going to go through foundational change. What are you thinking about these days?
Yeah, look, in energy, there's just a lot of excitement today around certainly renewables. But I go back to what are some of the, are there ways to detect methane remotely to make gas pipelines more effective? What are the technologies that are going to take current industries and make them more effective on one end? And then I would go build on the other end of energy is what are the really foundational technologies, whether it's batteries clearly are one, but things like fusion and things like that are actually at scale clean technology. So in energy, I would go to the small things that can help legacy industries today, all the way to what's really a 100% clean baseload technology for the future. I think in aviation, I'm really compelled by some of the startup companies that are going back to, kind of supersonic flight to see if there really is a way to make air travel effective at speed. And whether or not that works or can work economically, I think that is really a super interesting concept. In healthcare, there's 1,000 things I could talk about in healthcare, but the ability to take AI and data and actually drive superior outcomes, that has yet to happen in healthcare. And where can that industry go from a standpoint of leveraging really the new data tools? So, the tech industry's impact on healthcare has been nothing so far. And yet, if you think about the tech world bill that you came out of, it's transformed every other industry. So that's out there yet for healthcare. And then I just think coming out of this incredible supply chain issue we have today globally, what are some of the data tools that could route trucks and ships and ports more effectively? Again, you look at this and just say, this is a 1950s logistics system in a global supply chain in a pandemic. Nobody can be surprised that we're having the kinds of problems we're having. So I think most of these industries, I guess the bottom line, and you're smart about building, I don't really follow the building industry, are still decades behind where they can be just from the use of technology, data, automation, and those basic technologies.
You're in the building industry, it is a dichotomy. It's actually, the property industry as a whole is the largest component of global GDP. If you add up everything that goes into it. Yet it's the least digitized industry on the planet. And a lot of it is that it's very conservative. The culture is one of take no risk or push risk to other people. There's a lot of bureaucracy to it. And quite honestly, individually, the construction and developers, they don't always want to make that shift. Because the question is who benefits. And in the end, maybe it's the landowner, so you don't make a change if you don't benefit on it. So, and you've seen all this, but the thing that's interesting, Jeff, is prop tech is now the number 2 area of investment globally by the venture community. So this has been a banner year, a lot of money going into it. So we're starting to see that shift, but it's very, very early on.
Yeah, and I think you've lived it. So you're going to look not so much at the wow technology, but what are the outcomes that are going to come from it? And I think the one thing that's really, I think, just a systemic change, it's just this labor shortage that we're going to have, certainly in the U.S. and some other countries around the world. And I think that's going to force adoption of technologies. Look, there's just not going to be people that go around and check on apartments anymore. There's just not going to be, you're not going to be able to count on construction crews. And, I could go down the list. So I think a very profound labor shortage might be the kind of crisis that the property industry needs to actually start embracing new technology. And that's not unusual. Typically, you need a crisis of some kind to really drive adoption in a more profound way.
Yeah, I think that's what everybody kind of feels. Or great competition coming out of left field that threatens your existence. You have met all the world's great leaders, all the business leaders, technology leaders, politicians. Are there a few people you looked at and said, wow, I learned something, or those were great leaders, or what could you share about learnings and things you've seen and people you thought were outstanding leaders?
I've always, Bill, had a great love for founders who could scale. So I'd say my hero is like Fred Smith at FedEx, who, started the company with 6 or 7 planes. 40 years later, he's as engaged, as vibrant, as completely, kind of focused on the future as he was 40 years ago, right? And so I think it's so hard to scale. When you find people that know how to do it, you have to just say it's great. I just think the tech CEOs of this generation, Bezos and Steve Jobs and Tim Cook, the Google founders, Facebook, you just go up and down the coast. You just have to say they've been pretty amazing, right? The combination of speed and scale and learning and all that stuff, the value of an idea, you just have to say they've been really great. I've always had a real love for the Indian entrepreneurs. I've always had both a personal relationship and kind of a respect, Reliance. Mukesh Ambani decides he's going to get in the cell phone business, and 2 years later, he's the biggest in the world, right? We can't even get our head wrapped around, that kind of speed and scale. And probably my favorite politician, and she just retired, but I always thought Angela Merkel was a really good leader, did a good job of kind of like being politically astute, but having a real beacon for doing the right thing. And I think that's rare. But, the fun part about a job like the one I had is anybody would have lunch with you once. It didn't matter. You had to earn the second time, but you had a chance to really learn from some really great people. Another person I throw on the list is Michael Dell. Michael's a friend and somebody that I worked with for a long time. And his ability, again, to kind of twist and turn and be flexible and change his business model, I think is just something to be admired.
I think it's interesting. A lot of people are talking about the conglomerate being dead. Yet I go back to what you were talking about. The fact is the tech companies are all becoming conglomerates of the future. What do you think about this? Is it dead? Is it just changing? And where does it go?
I'd say if you look at legacy companies, multi-business structures where you have competitive advantage in 3 or 4 things, that's not dead. Really, I think, should a company be in insurance and media at the same time? I'd say that's too much, right? But being able to do aviation and power and healthcare, shared technology, shared global footprint, all those things, I still think you can build a compelling case for that. So I would say that's first and foremost. The second thing is a lot of these things are just banker themes, right? So becoming conglomerates, these are fee machines for investment bankers. Breaking up GE into 3 pieces, that's probably $400 or $500 million of banker fees right there. And I look back and forth at the businesses we've sold or kept, and at the end of the day, Bill, what it really comes down to is the way you and I started this conversation. If you have great products, you have great businesses. You can do that if you're focused. You can do that at scale if you're a conglomerate. But it comes down to, if an independent set of independent businesses, if they develop better products and more of them, they're going to be successful. But if having the global research center and things like that help businesses have great products, they're not going. Focus isn't going to matter. It's not going to be successful. And then, getting to your question, the conglomerates of yesteryear were based on, I'd say, processes and management science and stuff like that. That doesn't mean anything today, right? I think the conglomerates today are based on technology, innovation, technical scale, vision of technology. And I think those still have a long runway. So whether you're a legacy company or a startup, if your structure gives you the ability to make better products and services, you're going to be right. And if it doesn't help you, if the complexity doesn't deliver that or the focus doesn't deliver that, you're going to fail. Doesn't matter what structure you're in. And I think that gets lost in all the, gibberish of media coverage.
It is true. It's just innovation has to lead to a product. And if you got the right product with a business model, you can ride that and you're going to win.
Big or small, focused or conglomerate, it's just that simple, and if you go back like 20 years ago, when I was growing up in G, say, well, look, we all did Six Sigma, so it all makes sense. That doesn't mean shit today. In other words, that all got left decades ago. Now it's products, services, customer value, globalization. Those are the things that matter.
So how do you think about, in a few just final topics, how do you think about AI and machine learning these days? Do you think it's becoming real, and data, and you talked about that. But I think 2 issues. One is, how do you think about it socially? Is it heading in the right direction? And how important is it to the innovations you're looking at today?
Yeah, look, I think, Bill, you were early into this whole thing. I think AI has come further than I thought it would come. I think when you and I started, we kind of thought that like having deep domain around an industry was a competitive barrier. I'm not so sure. I think now just being able to use data, being able to model effectively, there's still, if you can add great data, great industry knowledge. You still have better, but the advances in AI have been really profound. And so I just think no matter what business you're in, you've got to understand how that fits and where it can go and things like that. In terms of it's a hard thing to harness where science and technology goes. We're at this incredible moment in time, and I'll speak now in the U.S. because I know the data a little bit better. Where labor participation rate is gone from 68% to 61% over the last let's say 20 years. So we have a shortage of workers, yet we're worried about AI and automation creating an excess of jobs. So it's almost impossible to have the technical impact on jobs at the same time that participation rate is at an all-time low and we don't have enough workers. So how that all sorts out, I'm not smart enough, but every legacy player should understand the role that new technologies like AI are going to play in their industry and how quickly they're going to come, because the technology is real.
And is the next generation, from your teaching at Stanford, is the next generation of business leaders becoming technically savvy, or are we still keeping these domains separate? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think, Bill, there's certainly more tech accepting, right? There's certainly more. I think tech savvy is probably the right word. They think about things in the technical prism. I'd say where they're lacking today is they still don't understand domains like the one you're in. The physical world. Like I'd say we've gone to the digital world with our students, and now they don't know anything about the physical world anymore, and that's going to be a gap. So I'd say we've yet to find the happy medium between the digital and the physical, which is really what the world's going to be about, even in their lifetime, in the next 30 or 40 years.
No, I think that's right. And you and I saw that over the last decade. And even if you look at what's Elon Musk, he's a master of the physical and digital world simultaneously. That's where the future is, and better outcomes.
That's where the future is. Amazon the same way. I think that's what's missing, I would say, right? And so I think people that can do both, and that's a lot what we teach our class about, is just the intersection between the physical and the digital.
So what's next for Jeff? You still you got any? You're still doing the venture work. You're still doing the teaching. You're going to write another book. What's next for Jeff?
No more books. I had one book in me, but I would say I had a hypothesis when I retired that I would enjoy working with entrepreneurs, and that's been true. I've loved it. I've enjoyed it. I've got ways to add value, which I wanted to do in the next phase of my life, and it's been great fun. Right? I'd say, Bill, I do 50% healthcare. And then the rest is a smattering of IoT and industrial automation and things like that. So it's all kind of, and I can work as hard as I want to, but I only work on the things that I really want to work on, and that's a joy. And then, Bill. So look, in many ways, the two of us in like 2010. We kind of started thinking about digital transformation, and we were too early, and in some ways we both got scars, because we were probably 5 or 6 years, but, it is happening. And I kind of want to see how the world looks going in the future. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal a week or so ago basically saying, it was kind of an op-ed piece saying, this is the end of the IT department, right? That basically when all people are really becoming digital savvy, the reason for being of the classic IT department has ended, really. And that's true, kind of, and I'd say all of those organizational changes and innovative changes are all still ahead of us on digital transformation. And I kind of want to see how it all plays through.
Well, thank you, Jeff. This has been special. Always inspiring to me. It's great to see you, Jeff. Thank you for the time.
Good to see you. I wish you nothing but success. Yeah, and I hope to get back to Australia someday when the world opens up again.